It was a cold winter evening in a small American town. Snow slowly covered the streets as people hurried home to their families. Christmas lights sparkled in the distance, filling the town with warmth and hope. But for Sarah Thompson, hope felt very far away. At 38 years old, Sarah sat alone in her tiny apartment, staring at a pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. Just 2 years earlier, life had seemed perfect. She had a loving husband named Michael, a beautiful daughter named Emma, and a comfortable home. Then tragedy struck. Michael was diagnosed with a rare illness. Despite countless treatments and endless prayers, he passed away within a year. His death shattered Sarah's world. The medical bills drained their savings. The mortgage became impossible to pay. Eventually, Sarah and Emma lost their home. Now they lived in a small apartment, barely surviving from paycheck to paycheck. That evening, Sarah looked toward the ceiling and whispered, "God, I've prayed every day, I've trusted you, but why does it feel like you've forgotten me?" No answer came, only silence. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Meanwhile, in her bedroom, 10-year-old Emma knelt beside her bed. Unlike her mother, Emma still believed with all her heart. She folded her tiny hands and prayed, "Dear God, please help Mommy smile again. That's all I want." Then she climbed into bed and fell asleep. The next morning brought another challenge. Sarah arrived at work only to discover that the company was downsizing. Several employees were being laid off. When her manager called her into the office, her heart sank. Within minutes, her worst fear became reality. She had lost her job. Walking home through the cold wind, Sarah felt completely broken. She didn't know how she would pay rent. She didn't know how she would buy groceries. Most of all, she didn't know how she would explain everything to Emma. That evening, she forced a smile and told her daughter, "Everything will be okay." But Emma could see the sadness in her mother's eyes. Later that night, Emma quietly wrote a letter. Not to Santa, not to a friend. To God, she wrote, "Dear God, Mommy says everything will be okay, but I know she's scared. I miss Daddy too. If you can hear me, please send us a miracle. Love, Emma." The next day, Emma folded the letter and placed it inside an old wooden church donation box on her way home from school. She believed God would somehow receive it. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. Sarah still couldn't find work. Their savings disappeared. Food became scarce. One evening, Sarah opened the refrigerator and found almost nothing inside. A carton of milk, a few eggs, and half a loaf of bread. That was all. She sat at the table feeling defeated. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, nobody was there. Only 3 large bags of groceries sat on the doorstep. Confused, she looked around. The street was empty. Inside the bags were fresh vegetables, fruit, bread, milk, and even a turkey. Attached was a small note. It simply said, "God sees you." Sarah looked around again. No one, not a single person. For the first time in months, she smiled. Maybe it wasn't a miracle. Maybe it was simply kindness. But somehow, it felt like an answer. Across town lived an elderly man named Robert. Few people knew his story. Years earlier, Robert had lost his wife and son in a tragic accident. The grief nearly destroyed him. For years, he lived alone. Then one Sunday, while cleaning an old church storage room, he discovered a collection of letters. Most were written by children, prayers, dreams, requests for help. One letter stood out. It was Emma's. "Please help Mommy smile again." Robert read the words over and over. Something touched his heart. He couldn't explain it. Perhaps God was speaking through that little girl's faith. So Robert decided to help. Without revealing his identity, he began leaving groceries at their door. Then he paid their utility bill anonymously. A week later, he covered 2 months of rent. Each time he left the same message, "God sees you." Sarah couldn't understand what was happening. Someone was helping them, but who and why? One evening, she sat in church after everyone had left. The sanctuary was silent. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. She whispered, "God, if this is you, thank you." Sometimes God's blessings don't arrive the way we expect. Sometimes they arrive through people willing to listen to His voice. Those words stayed with her. Months passed. Life slowly improved. Sarah eventually found a part-time job. It didn't pay much, but it was enough to keep moving forward. Emma continued praying every night, and Robert continued helping from a distance. Yet one day, everything changed. Robert suffered a heart attack. He survived, but doctors informed him that his health was declining rapidly. Lying in a hospital bed, he reflected on his life. He thought about his wife, his son, and the little girl whose letter had given him purpose again. For the first time in years, he felt peace. Before leaving the hospital, Robert made a decision. He asked the pastor to arrange a meeting. A few days later, Sarah and Emma arrived at the church. They had no idea why they had been invited. Inside a small room sat Robert. He looked frail but kind. His eyes filled with tears when he saw Emma. The pastor gently explained everything. The groceries, the rent, the bills, the anonymous gifts. It had all come from Robert. Sarah was speechless. Emma stared in amazement. Then she asked, "Why did you help us?" Robert smiled. His voice trembled. "Because your letter reminded me that God wasn't finished with me." Emma looked confused. Robert continued, "You asked God to help your mother smile again, but you don't realize something." "What?" Emma asked. Robert's eyes filled with tears. "You also helped me smile again." For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Emma ran forward and hugged him tightly. Everyone in the room cried, even the pastor. Over the next year, Robert became like family. He attended Emma's school events. He joined them for holidays. And for the first time since losing Michael, Sarah no longer felt alone. Life wasn't perfect. There were still struggles, still challenges, still moments of uncertainty. But there was hope, and hope changes everything. One spring afternoon, Sarah received a phone call. A local company wanted to interview her for a management position. The interview went well. A week later, she got the job. The salary was more than she had earned before. Gradually, she rebuilt her life. She paid off debts, saved money, and eventually purchased a small home. The future finally seemed bright again. Years passed. Emma grew into a remarkable young woman. She never forgot the lessons she learned during those difficult days. She studied hard, worked tirelessly, and eventually became a pediatric nurse. Her dream was simple: to help children facing difficult circumstances. One evening, after finishing a long shift at the hospital, Emma visited Robert. He was now 90 years old. Age had slowed him considerably, but his spirit remained strong. They sat together on the porch watching the sunset. After a long silence, Robert asked, "Do you remember the letter you wrote to God?" Emma smiled. "Of course." Robert chuckled softly. "You know, I think God answered it." Emma nodded. "He did." Robert looked surprised. "You really believe that?" Emma pointed toward the sky painted orange and gold by the setting sun. Then she said, "I asked God to help my mother smile again." She paused. "He sent you." Robert's eyes filled with tears. For a moment, neither spoke. The sunset continued glowing across the horizon, a reminder that even the darkest nights eventually end. A few months later, Robert peacefully passed away in his sleep. The entire town attended his funeral. People shared countless stories, stories of generosity, stories of kindness, stories of lives changed by his compassion. When it was Emma's turn to speak, she walked slowly to the podium. The church became silent. She unfolded a piece of paper. It wasn't a speech. It was the letter she had written as a child, the same letter she had placed inside the church donation box months earlier. Her voice shook as she read it aloud. Many people wiped away tears. Then she looked toward the audience Thank you, God, not because life had been easy, not because every prayer had been answered immediately, but because she had learned something powerful. God's timing is different from ours. Sometimes blessings arrive after heartbreak. Sometimes hope appears after despair. Sometimes the answer comes through unexpected people. And sometimes what feels like the end is actually the beginning of a miracle. As Emma walked away, a sense of peace filled her heart, the same peace that comes when we finally understand God never forgot us. He was working quietly all along, and His blessings often arrive through the hands of those willing to love others. The end read more. God's blessings don't